Okay, so tonight we're going to be picking up from where we left off in the Seder of the Aleph Beis. So we ended off after discussing the Aleph in a very succinct kind of way. Took a lot of tzimtzum in order to kind of minimize how much we were talking about at the Aleph. But tonight we're going to be talking about the letter Beis. Now, for Chazara, last week we saw the Aleph as this koyach hagvul bebilti gvul, this capacity towards limitation within the infinite. So in a certain level, that's the first instantiation of Hashem's presence in this world that we're capable of speaking about. But at the same point, because it's such a lofty level and it's still an aspect of Ein Sof, so to speak, so the relationship that we have with the Aleph is one of hafla'a, of Aleph being the lashon of Pella, or mafli la'asos, of hishtomimus and shtika. And Rav Kook describes that the only association, the only relationship we can actually have with the Aleph is one of Targum, is one of always already translating it into a secondary language, the non-primary language. So Aleph, being the first building block, is already reminding us that everything we talk about when we talk about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we talk about Tzimtzum, when we talk about Hashem's relationship with the world, is a level removed from Atzmusa Yisparach. Nevertheless, there's a statement in the Zohar that Keser Ilah, the loftiest level of Keser, the loftiest level in the Seder of the Hishtalshalos that we're capable of speaking about, Ukam Hu Klape Shmaya. It's considered as darkened, it's considered as black with regards to what is above it, which means to say that the loftiest level, the Keser, the beginning point of Hishtalshalos, the highest point of Ein Sof, on a certain level is simply the lowest part of something removed from us. Sort of like we were describing last week, that the koyach hagvul within the infinite, the capacity towards limitation within the infinite, is already the bottom part, the tzad hatzmol, from where the vav of the Aleph starts descending down, from that techuna hahitmatut that Rav Kook describes, the nature of diminishment that Ein Sof has. So, although we're talking about a minimization of Ein Sof, vis-a-vis where we're at as created beings, the Aleph itself is a total Pella. It's absolutely above, and it's absolutely removed. So the letter Beis is already going to be the attempt to try and grasp the Aleph. Like we spoke about in the first introductory shiur, the Aleph Beis doesn't operate in a system of Ilav Alul, where there's one level, and then when you get to the next level, there's no relationship with the previous level. But rather, it's a siba atzmit. Each letter, like the Maharal would tell us, is an essential cause of the next letter, and because it's an essential cause, it remains tied up with the next letter in the Seder Hishtalshalos. So like we discussed in the first week, there's not so much an Aleph, Beis, a Gimel, a Dalet, a Hey, v'chulei, but there's one Aleph, and then there's two Alfin, and then there's three Alfin, to the point where you get to Tuf, which is the 400 Alfin. But even within the lowest level of the Aleph Beis, at its tachtis, at the Tuf, we still have the capacity to discover and uncover and disclose the Aleph that's hidden within it. So when we talk about the transition from Aleph to Beis, we're not only talking about Aleph remaining in its, infinitude, we're actually talking about a more paradoxical and a more difficult question to answer, which is how does the Aleph, how does infinitude manifest within limitation? How does the Aleph find itself within the Beis without either losing its infinitude of the Aleph and without negating the limitation of the Beis? Now, this is a question that the Maharal asks and that the Rishonim ask. Specifically, how do we have shnius coming from achdus? How can we have duplicity? How can we have multiplicity coming out of unity? That's one of the more fundamental philosophical questions that Jewish thinkers have come to answer. We believe deeply in the unity of God, one of the Yud Gimel Ikrei Emunah. But at the same point, we believe in the mitzias of the world. And even those who want to claim a cosmic notion of the world, like in the writings of the Balatanya, according to certain interpreters of the Balatanya, nevertheless, any time that you want to read in the Balatanya that there's no mitzias, that it's in a cosmic reality, and that there's nothing but Ein Sof, the Balatanya is going to walk us back and remind us that it's even a level of kfira to deny the mitzias of the world. So as Jews, we have to accept the mitzias, the material world, as a mitzias. But how do we understand the interrelationship between the Aleph which is the infinite, and the Beit, which is the beginning or the instantiation or the inception point of duplicity, how do we understand how they can have a continued relationship without either losing either side of its strength? So here Rav Kook is going to begin discussing the letter Beis, and what he's talking about here is really what the Kabbalists, what the Arizal, and what the Ramak would describe as Kalim. In terms of understanding the world through the outlook of the Jewish mystical thinkers, our Kabbalists, our Mikubalim, there's very often a simple dichotomy of materials that we can look at with regards to how the world operates. There's something called orot, or oros, which are going to be the spiritual lights. They're going to be the notion of non-limitation within the world, the notion of the neshama vis-a-vis the guf. Now, Ramchal and various other Mikubalim have stressed to us that the only reason that we utilize the mashal, the metaphor of light, is because on a certain level, at least according to their understanding, it is the least physical of all physical aspects. So light is something physical, but yet on the same point, it's intangible, at least according to the scientific methods that they were operating with at that point. So when we talk about oros, we're not obviously talking about energy, and we're not talking about any type of light, but we're talking about the way, the vehicle through which Hashem has decided to manifest in the world. And corresponding to those lights, we have a notion called kelim. We have a notion of vessels. Now, famously, the vessels are most well known from this traumatic experience of Shirat HaKelim, the shattering of the vessels, which the Arizal describes, drawn from the Zohar and Jaraban and Jazuta. But nevertheless, we have this, split dichotomy between the orot, the spiritual capacity of the world, and the kelim, the physical capacity of the world, or the limiting aspects that allow spirituality to settle into manageable sizes so that we can actually experience them. Now, orot, on a certain level, are Hashem's way of expressing himself to the world. It's the spirituality, it's the neshama. Kelim, on the other hand, are more of the virtual vessels that Hashem has created in order to mitigate the intensity of his light, in order to capture the light and then refract it in a way that is no longer so overwhelming. Because without the kelim, without vessels, the or would be too strong, and the presence of infinitude, the presence of Ein Sof would be too strong, and there would not only not be Bechira, but there wouldn't even be the capacity for there to be a creation other than God. So the letter Beis for Rav Kook is going to be the first inception point, the first birth of what we know of as Kelim. Yet he's also going to lead us in an interesting direction, and I believe this is also taken from the Leshem, where Kelim are not so diametrically opposed to Orot, in the sense that we have this dichotomy or this dualistic vision of spirituality and physicality, or infinitude and finite, or unlimited and limitation, or neshama and guf, but rather the interrelationship between the two of them is less of one of stark difference and more of a relationship where one becomes the other through a process of slowly but surely moving away from its primordial space and manifesting in more of a role of physicality. So, in other words, the kelim are not other than the light. They're not other than the oros, but the kelim themselves are a different type of manifestation of the orot themselves. To the extent that if a person penetrates and a person contemplates and a person utilizes the neshama hasichlis to understand the nature of limitation and contraction and suffering and smallness and measurements of this world, if they penetrate it deeply enough, what they'll come to find is that the kelim are nothing but a veiled manifestation of the light itself, to the point that there is not this dualistic standpoint that the Ramchal and other Mikubalim came to fight so strongly against in Das Tvunos, but rather it's a unity of only Or Ein Sof that has the capacity to manifest itself either in the guise of Orot or in the guise of Kelim. Now, where Rav Kook is going to be getting this from, or where the Leshem got this from, is really the Arizal and Shar HaAkudim. Now, in Shar HaKudim, the Arizal and Eitz Chaim describes the first instantiation of Orot, of Kelim, He describes the first process of how Kelim come into being. And something profound is expressed there. Utilizing kind of spatial and temporal analogies, if you will, the Arizal describes this process, or this dual process, or this unified duality because really they're part and parcel of the same expression, they're part and parcel of the same movement, but because we're stuck in time and limited, we have to perceive them through a duration where they appear different from one another. So there's a process of hispashtut v'hitzklalut. Hispashtut v'histalkut. There's egression, there's something coming out of the infinite, moving down towards the world, and yet at the same point, that same expression is mistalek itself, it elevates itself back up. So when the Arizal is describing the process of the Kalim building in Olam HaAkudim, in the bounded worlds of Akudim, he describes this process which is going to be found at every stage of the Seder HaShtalshelus, that there's a light, a pure light of Orot Kavyachol that comes out of Ein Sof, that comes out of the infinite, that comes out of Adam Kadmon, and that light then elevates itself back up. So it is expressed and then immediately it regresses back up to its original space. But something happens, according to Arizal, where because the light left the space of infinity and it entered into the space of finitude or other than godliness, so there was a certain physicality, there was a certain manifestation that took place through the distance from Achdus HaPashut, and there's a residue left over. The light that comes out from Ein Sof and returns back to Ein Sof, that remains the same light. But because this light came down and entered into a space of separateness or concealment from God, there was a certain engarbment, there was a certain physicality that took place to the light, and it remains on a certain level a little bit too coarse, a little bit too thick to return back to the infinite. Now that light, that coarse light, that Orha Gas, that the Arizal describes, is the first instantiation of Kalim. So we have something profound that the Arizal is telling us. He's telling us that the way Kalim are built is not that there's Or and then Hashem Kavyachol uses a different material of limitation or concealment to create a vessel, but rather the vessel itself is built off of the residual light of the Or itself. So that if you penetrate deeply enough into the recesses of the Kalim, what you'll come to find is that they're nothing but crystallized aspects of light. And if a person conceptualizes this and davens on it and thinks about it and applies to their personal lives, we can find the mashal in our own lives, that what appears to be distant and what appears to be removed and distorted from our aspects of clarity and spirituality is nothing but a sedimented type of thickness that comes from the residual remainder of absent spirituality. So with that introduction, we're going to start with Rav Kook, because we're going to see again that Beis, the first Kli, the first inception point of Kalim, is nothing but the removal of the Aleph. It's not that Hashem created a Beis, but because Aleph is so lofty and so transcendent, in its place we find the only thing that we can relate to, which is the Beis. So Rav Kook says as follows, he says, bias. So letter Beis, when you spell it out, Beis Yud Taf, also spells out the word bias, which means a dwelling place, which means a home, which means that the light of the Aleph, the Or of the Aleph, that infinite light that our only relationship with it is Ishtomimus, it needs a dwelling place, it needs a place to live in the world. Acharei sheyesh tochen. Now, after we've completed the Aleph, and we now have at least a content that we can discuss, because again, we said that the Aleph is the Koyach HaGvul B'Bilti Gvul, but beyond the Aleph, there's no discussion whatsoever. That Leis Machshava Tvisa Beklal, Afilu Berusa Deliba, we have no relationship with Atzmusa Yisparach. But Aleph is the first expression of Tochen. So Acharei sheyesh Tochen, after we have a notion of content, sheyeshna Tzura Reshit, there's an original form. And again, here the Maharal, the Rav Kook is utilizing language, Aristotelian language as expressed through the Rambam and then through the Maharal, most probably, of Tzura and Chomer, Tzura being spirituality and Chomer, for lack of a full explication of the term, being more of a physicalized manifestation in the world. After Sheyeshna Tzura Reshit, Harekan Tiferas Adam Lashavas Babayas. The grandeur, the beauty of the individual is that they sit in a house, meaning that Hashem doesn't want the Aleph to remain in its abstract transcendence, but rather the Tiferes for HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the creation of the world is Ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lios Lo Dira B'Tachtonim. That the Tiferes, the beauty that will come from existence, is specifically when it manifests in Kalim, when we're able to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through Kalim themselves. Tzrichim kfar lahachin beis kibul el hatzuros hamithavot. Now we already need to prepare for ourselves a beis kibul, a receptacle, a reception device, a house, a kli, a vessel that can contain within itself the tzuros hamithavot. These forms that are now, once they've been expressed through the aleph, are only going to continue to express themselves. That's a klal gadol in Kitvei Rav Kook, that once something happens on the spiritual level, it's not going to stop unless there's an active vacancy placed in its place. Until there's an interruption or a disruption to the spiritual flow, that spiritual flow, that ore, will continue flowing forever. So the aleph, even though it's the first instantiation of tochen, it will continue to create more forms, hatzuros hamithavot, which we now need a bias for. El hamon hachayil haba v'shotef, to the vast chayil, to the vast strengths, and to the vast forces that are now coming and flowing forth. Hasichuch v'ha'atima ha'poalim shelo tofia ha'ora b'shifasa hatzurit hamubshata. The sichuch and the atima. Here, sichuch is melashon schach, which means a covering, and atima is melashon atum, which means a concealment. Now here Rav Kook is placing in two small words a profound disagreement amongst the Mekubalim with regards to the notion of tzimtzum, whether it was a tzichuch, a simple covering or a concealment of infinitude, or whether it was an atima, an actual constriction of infinitude. But we're not going to get too much into that discussion because it's not very clear from Rav Kook's writings, although there have been various attempts to explicate his notion of tzimtzum. It's not clear. I believe that Rav Yosef Avivi in his new writings probably does more for this sugya than anybody else, but I haven't gotten those far yet, so it's not clear yet what Rav Kook wants to say, but he's here giving us the two tzadim of tzimtzum. One is that it's tzichuch, a covering, which means that the infinitude, the Or Ein Sof, is still underneath it, but it's simply covered and it's not truly removed. Or an atima, which means that it's an actual limitation. It's a closing off of that infinite light, which implies an actual siluk, an actual removal. These two ways of constriction, the covering or the limiting, which serve to ensure that the light in its actual form, meaning by the level of aleph, the unlimited form, the Beis here is coming to make sure that the aleph does not manifest in a way that is too overwhelming for creation. The aleph's job, the Beis' job, is to ensure that the aleph does not reveal itself to the extent that it will nullify any capacity for there to be anything other than the aleph. So the job of the Beis, the job of the kli, is to come and constrict the light, yet allow for the light to still be relevant and to still be clear through the act of understanding and penetrating the kli. Heim hagormim l'chomer sheyivne, lebeis kibul sagnoni v'tachsisi sheyetchonen. So here, I want to stop for a second and look at Rav Kook's language, because this is what we were discussing before in the name of the Arizal, by Shar HaEkudim, and especially by the Leshem, who expresses this in various places, that the manifestation of the Kli is not some secondary job that Hashem does once he removes Or, but rather the revelation of the Or itself is the manifestation of the Kli. Meaning to say that before Hashem decided to create the world, we had no capacity to understand infinity. We had no capacity to understand what it meant for there to be a creator who had the capacity to create a world. But once Hashem has created the world, that act of creation itself is an act of limitation, because now we have the aspect of relating to it. So the Kli, which is what allows for there to be a relationship with the infinite, is the same act of the removal of the Aleph itself. Or like the Ramak would say, and the Arizal expresses this in various places, that in Kabbalah, in terms of our understanding of the world, ha-he'elem hu hagiloi. Again, ha-he'elem hu hagiloi, the concealment is in and of itself the revelation, because when the light is too big, we have no relationship to it. So the act of concealing that light concurrently or simultaneously allows us to now engage with the light. So the he'elem of something that's too overwhelming becomes vice versa, or at the same moment, the manifestation of the light in a way that we're capable of grasping it. So Rav Kook says something amazing here. He says the sichach and the atima, the constriction and the covering that the bays or that the kli tries to impart, heim hagormim l'chomer sheyivneh. They themselves are the cause for chomer, for physicality to manifest. It's not that it was a two-step process. It's a one-step process. The limitation is the manifestation. So when the aleph enters into the base and it's concealed within this base kibul, so now we're already entering into the stage where chomer is beginning to build, where a manifested world is beginning to be built, something that we can actually relate to. So now Rav Kook is going to discuss the shape of the base and the fact that the opening of the base is not facing the aleph, but rather it's facing on the left side towards all the other osios that are coming. Pesichaso shel habayis. The opening of the house, the opening of the base, eineno mul ha'aleph. It's not turned towards the aleph. Luma tasura hamufshata, towards that kind of removed and ungarbed form of the aleph. Hakoleles hakol b'kirba, that contains everything within itself. Ki ela l'umas haruchush haba. Rather, the base is focused towards the ruchush haba, the coming inheritance, the manifested aspects of existence, of atzilus, of bria, of yetzira and asiya, of all limitation, ad kedei kach, that it's talking about our ability to exist in this world of limitation as we speak now. All of that is coming from the left side of the base. The base is facing towards us because the purpose of the kli for Rav Kook and for the Arizal is not for the infinite, but rather for the finite to be able to manifest. Now, the letters, the coming inheritance that will come out of the os beis are limited enough so that we can actually begin to talk about them and so that we can actually begin to interact with them. Avim v'chazakim heim hamechitzot hachotzatzot le'umot hama'al v'hatachas. So now Rav Kook is looking at the letter beis, and we'll just have a little diagram. Now he's talking about the two mechitzot, the one on the top and the one on the bottom, and he's describing the thickness of them. And he wants to understand why the bottom of the base and why the top of the base are so thick. And for Rav Kook, he's describing really what the Arizal would call the chalal hapanui, the first instantiation of the kli, that vacant space that Kavyachal HaKadosh Baruch Hu left when he vacated his Or Ein Sof out of it, that Simpson that we're also familiar with. That space is not simply a vacant space. God forbid, according to the Leshem, and I have the Leshem here, and I want to read inside just for a very quick moment to describe what the Leshem describes as this Halal HaPanui. So he says as follows. Amnan oso hamakom, that place, that Halal, hinehu eno panui mamish. It's not actually empty. Ubechinas reikani ve'edar chas v'shalom, of emptiness and absence, God forbid. Ki ein reikani klal, because there's no emptiness in existence whatsoever. Kamosha kasuf harav hakadosh, moreno harav Yosef Gektila b'sefer ginos egos chelak beis. She'ein reikus ba'olam, there's no actual emptiness in the entirety of existence. V'chein kasuf gamkein Rabbeinu hakadosh haramak ba'alima, she'ein reikus ve'edar chas v'shalom. V'chein amar harambam b'mor nevuchim chelak aleph. Amnan masha karu osam b'shem makom, or the chalal hapanu, or this empty space, is because ki hinei sham hu shifas kocha yisparach hanosa es kol hametzias kula. It's the expression of godliness that has the capacity to contain and carry within itself all of existence. V'harei hu hamakom l'chol hametzias. And this is what the Arizal calls the Chalal HaPanui. So we see very explicitly that this first instantiation of the vessel is not an absence of godliness, God forbid, but rather it's a presence of godliness, the Koyach HaGvul, the capacity towards limitation of Rabbeinu Azriel that we discussed last week, is finally expressing itself now. So this base needs to have the proper boundaries that separate it from that infinitude. So avim v'chazakim heim hamechitzos hachotzatzos leumas hama'al v'hatachas. Thick are the partitions, thick are the barriers that separate between the on top of the base and beneath the base. Mima'al l'chol gvul, above the base, harei ha'tu'ufa haromema shirua below gvul u'meitzar. On top of the Beis, before the Tzimtzum, before the Chalal HaPanui, it's infinite. There's no manifestation, there's no limitation, it's out of our capacity to speak, and the Beis' job is to come and separate us from that. But now Rav Kook says a Chiddush, and he goes on to say, Umitachas l'chol gvul, and underneath all limitation, meaning the bottom of the Beis, Harehu gam kein kimima'al l'chol gvul. It's also equal to on top of the gvul. Why? Because ein hama'al v'hatachas mityachsim le'ercheihem ki ele b'makom shehagvulim sholtim sham. Because above and below have no absolute value except in places where there's limitation. So Rav Kook is saying something profound, and it's a direct statement on a comment of the Arizal. He's saying that this Beis, which comes to interrupt, which comes to separate us from the Or Ein Sof, from that unlimited manifestation of the Aleph, so that we can begin to actually talk, so that we can begin to actually see duplicity in the world and multiplicity in the world, and have Bechira, because Beis is Bechira. Beis is the ability to have the choice between one of two things, the ability to make a decision. When there's only unity, there's no room for a decision. The instantiation of multiplicity, of duplicity from the letter Beis, from the number 2, from the not one, allows us now to choose between one or the other. So the job of the Beis is coming to build this safe house that protects us and allows us to live in the necessary space of limitation so that we can actually earn something, so that we can actually choose through our own volition to engage with godliness, as opposed to a kafiyah, which has no individualized or personal experience. So it's one thing to say that the Beis has to protect from on top of it, because we typically understand in terms of direction that the above is infinite. But what about below? What about below the halal? What about underneath this kli? So Rav Kook here is coming to say something to us where he's telling us that above and below, the directional notions that we have with regards to spirituality and with regards to infinity and Hashem's presence in the world is not absolute. It's relative. Above and below is only relative to the space where there's already limitation. But in the place where we're not talking about limitation, where it's infinite and unlimited, so above and below, it doesn't matter. Hashem is present there no matter what. Like the Medrash says, Kashem Shekilu So Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ba'a Megan Eden. The same way that the praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes from the neshamos of the tzaddikim in Gan Eden, Kain Ba'im Me Nishmos HaRisha'im Begehenim. So too does the praise of God from the souls of the wicked come from Gehenim. Because once limitation is no longer shaykh, once change or difference is no longer in the picture, there's no distinction between good and bad. It's beyond good and evil. It is the level of arich anpin, of ma'arich af, where there is no chova or schus, but rather it's a segula hapnimis that is above and beyond any ability of us to earn it or lose it. And Rav Kook here is explicitly building himself off of the Arizal. The Arizal in Heichel Adam Kadmon and Eitz Chaim expresses something profound. He says as follows: V'hine achar atzimtzum, after the first tzimtzum, asher az nishar makom hachalul v'ha'avir panoi, after there's that vacant space and that empty air, v'reikani be'emtza ha'or ha'ein sof, that Hashem kavyachol carved out this empty space, which for us is the Beis, which for us is the bias that now has the ability to experience Hashem's presence in the world without being nullified in it. He says that Ava'az Nimshach min ha'or ein sof kav aleph, Hashem drew forth a ray of infinite light back into that halal, yashar min ha'or, and it goes into this igul, it goes into this halal, and it doesn't touch the bottom. And the Arizal goes on to say that the reason the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world cannot touch the bottom, cannot touch the lower places of our lives, cannot touch the anxiety of our life, cannot touch the feelings of distance that we have, is because if the light of infinitude was able to touch the bottom of our experience and the experience of the world, so then for us there would be no difference between above and below. There would be no difference between Tov and Ra. So on a certain level, there was an arrested development in the manifestation and the expression of the Kav, of Hashem's presence in the world, so that there remains a distinction between above and below. Now the Rebbe Rashab in Taf Reish Nun Tes and the Leshem in Klalim, Klal Yud Zayin says something amazing. They say that La'aseh Lavo, and this is not something that's found in the Arizal. The Rebbe Rashab quotes various Mikubalim, but the Makoros and all the Svarim point us to other traditions within the Chabad tradition of interpreting the Arizal. But the Leshem says the same thing as well in Klal Yud Zayin and Sefer HaKlalim, where he says that the Asin Lavo, the Kav will be Yored to Tachtas HaIgul, that the line will Yored, the Kav Ein Sof will go down to the bottom of the Halal, so that the bottom will become the top and the top will become the bottom. There will be no distinction between above and below, between Gan Eden and Gehenna anymore, once Hashem reveals His infinitude. Now, Avada, our Bechira and our ability to earn that, will give us the ability to point to Hashem in the middle of that circle and say, we really earned this. But on an ontological level, there's really no distinction between above and below. So Rav Kook says that the Beis has to have a mechitza blocking the Or Ein Sof above the vessel and below the vessel, because Ein Hama'al v'hatachas mityachsim le'ercheihem, above and below have no relationship to their value, ki ela b'makom shehagvulim sholtim sham, except where limitation is reigning there. And Rav Kook continues, going further in the Beis. Lahatziv hama'amad shelo yichtar ha'or habilti mugval v'yatashtesh es kol hatzuros ha'apniyut ha'mugvalot. Now, again, Rav Kook is just reiterating what the purpose of the Beis is, what the purpose of the Kli is, to ensure that there is a standing, that limitation is allowed to stand. Because Tola Aretz al Blima, the Zohar says. Tola Aretz al Blima means that existence, that limitation, is always standing upon a yawning and murmuring sense of infinitude. And that if for one moment, like the Nefesh HaChaim describes in Shar Daled of Nefesh HaChaim with regards to not learning for a moment, if for one moment HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to be Masalik the Tzimtzum, Hashem decided to remove the veil of limitation, everything would revert not to destruction. It wouldn't be a cause and effect of Hashem removed and it would be destroyed. It would be null and void completely. So the Beis, the bias, the house, the protection that creates a fertile space for the Aleph to find manifestation is there to ensure that creation can manifest, is there to ensure that the infinitude of the Aleph, that the Tzura HaMufshatet of the Aleph, the unformed form of the Aleph doesn't find its way into the space of limitation, into the bias, v'yatashtesh es kol hatzuros, and to negate and ruin all of the forms. Lazeh sarach binyan esan. This is why the top of the Beis and the bottom of the Beis have to be so thick, because it takes strength, it takes a real courage, it takes a real koach from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that koach hagvul of tzimtzum, that he'elem ha'atzmi that the Rebbe Rashab spoke so much about, to the point that it's a greater manifestation of Hashem to manifest in limitation than it is to manifest in unlimitedness. Chatziva v'chazaka, it has to be present and strong. Kimin ma'aziva. It has to be, I asked some people how to translate ma'aziva, but I believe the way I'm translating it is as a caulking, as a certain cementing between the wall and the ceiling, as discussed in Maseches Sukkah. It has to be something that protects the leakage of the Aleph, the leakage of Or Ein Sof back into the space of limitation. Amnan, however, and here Rav Kook is now going to be asking about a different part of the Aleph, which is the thinner side. Because the Aleph is going to be over here, and Rav Kook is going to be asking and trying to understand why this mechitza is thinner than the thick mechitza on top and the bottom. So Rav Kook goes on and he says, Aval lo amnan gam lahagvil es hagvul mitzadav hinenu osukim. We're also not only coming to create a limit or a vessel that separates between the infinite light above and below the vessel, but we're also coming to limit the expression of the Aleph within the world itself. And he goes on to say, Emesu sheponahu hatochin hamagvil es hagvulim lahahoman harav shalanigvalim asher shatfu v'yavu keshetef hamayim. So here Rav Kook is saying, yes, we have to create a limitation. Yes, there has to be a tzimtzum. Yes, there has to be a vacancy, a vacant space that's not truly vacant or empty, that allows for creation to exist in an apparent independence from the infinite light that subsumes it and exists it and surrounds it and fills it and is mamala and is sovev it. But at the same point, as we know from the Arizal, we also have a kav. we have a Kav Ein Sof, meaning there has to be somewhat of a relationship between the Aleph and the Beis for the Beis to mean anything whatsoever. Because it's one thing for Hashem to create a Beis or the bias or the Kli that entirely blocks out the Or Ein Sof, and to create a world that is devoid of infinitude, that is entirely devoid of Hashem's relationship with it, God forbid. But here we're trying to understand the Pella, the paradoxical space of Raza de Mehem Nusa, of how do we limit the Aleph, yet still maintain a direct relationship with the Aleph, like we spoke about last week. That's the Pella. It's not a chiddush to say that Hashem was once the Aleph and now he's the Beis and we don't have shaykhs to the Aleph anymore. A lot of religions, a lot of philosophers have come and said such things. What we're trying to do, Beraz de Mehem Nusan, the secret of faith, which means that at the end of the day, it's beyond the capacity of intellectual knowledge, but rooted in a faith that's a learned ignorance on a certain level. We're trying to understand how we can have our cake and eat it too, how we can have the unlimited, yet at the same point have limitation. But the unlimited doesn't lose any of its capacity to be unlimited, and limitation doesn't lose any of its capacity to be limited. So how can we have ein v'yesh, limit and non-limit, interacting as one? So for Rav Kook here, it means that the Beis still has to allow for a certain leakage, a certain ray, a certain presence of the Aleph within the space of the Beis, so that the Beis doesn't just become this, dungeon that blocks us from Or Ein Sof, but rather a vessel that allows us to experience Or Ein Sof in a clearer way. So Rav Kook goes on and says, Avalo kol hanigval mitgala b'tzura haviyatit. Now, once we have this Beis, what it does is it does not allow the Aleph to manifest itself b'tzura haviyatit, in its essential existence, in its essential form. And we also need a thin wall to allow us to interact with the minimized and diminished light of the Aleph that we have access to. That's still too big for us. Even when Hashem only returns back a Kav, even when Hashem says, Kav Yachal, I will take away 99% of the infinitude and I will leave 1% of the infinite. Even that 1%, so to speak, is too strong for us to experience without a mechitza daka, a thin barrier, a thin partition, hachotzetzes uma'akeves gam es koach hachalush hazeh, that blocks and interrupts between even this weakened form of the Aleph. Shelo yachdor b'makom she'eina ra'oi lo, that it should not enter into a place where it doesn't have any place engaging with, so that we still have access to limitation. Hatziur, says Rav Kook, the image of the Aleph, asher yishar beta'aluma, that remains in concealment and in hiddenness, be'omek hadmama ra'uloi lehisakev al yedei misipas. The Sior Asher Yishar B'Ta'aluma, the Aleph that remains in concealment, because it's not, God forbid, removed, it's simply contained. That remains in Ta'aluma, in hiddenness. Be'omek hadmama, in the depth of silence, beyond voice, beyond speech, beyond Aleph Beis, beyond the instantiation of language. Be'omek hadmama ra'oloi lehisakev al yedei misipas. Here Rav Kook is just showing his Bekias and his Geonis that even when he's osek in Reish Millin, he also has his mind in the Gemara in Bava Basra, I believe it's on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, where it talks about a mesipas between properties, which means a small partition of pegs. Parenthetically, Rav Betzal Naor said, I believe at his introduction to the new Rav Kook Siddur that he introduced at Lincoln Square Synagogue, where he described something he heard B'Pamale from Rav Tzvi Yehuda, where Rav Kook said the same tzav, the same command, the same or, the same enlightenment, the same soul spark that allowed Rav Kook to write Reish Millin, which according to Rav Tzvi Yehuda was his deepest sefer, was also what drove Rav Kook to write Halacha Brura, which is also what drove Rav Kook to engage in the minutia of halacha, of Hariyu LaHashem Kol Haaretz, which is Rosh Tevos Halacha. And so we have just a remez here that in the midst of Rav Kook describing in this poetic, strange way the manifestation of vessels that allow for a separation between infinity and finitude, or unlimited and limited, or overwhelmingness and manageability, he's still utilizing terms from Chazal in a very specific sugya. Mechitza daka, a very thin barrier, mibli lachtor el hagvulim hatzrichim lehistayu legalos, so as not to negate the barriers and the partitions and the limitations and the concealments that need to be revealed. Lo mima'al velo mitachas l'chol hagvulim hu atochen hamitaleim ba'omek hayesod ha'avyati. It's not above or below existence where the tochen hamitaleim, the concealed essence, exists in its secret depths. It's not above or below the vessel. It's not above or below the base that the aleph still exists, but rather, betzido ubedargaso shakol hamitava hu omed. Rav Kook is saying here something amazing. He's saying, don't think for a second that because of the limitation of the base, that the aleph doesn't have presence anymore, that it's only above the partition of the base or below the partition of the base, but rather, hine hatochen hamitaleim be'omek hasod hahavyati. The concealed content that exists in the depths and the secrets of existence, it exists betzido ubedargaso shakol hametavahu omid. It's mamala kol almin, it fills the worlds. It's not the same revelation as it was before the base. Obviously, the aleph is now mitigated and veiled in the base and mitlabesh in the base, wearing it like a garment so that all you see is the garment. Yet it's still present, not above and below so that we can look up to Hashem or look down to Hashem, but rather it's there present in each and every level of existence. Aval me'ukavhu, but it's blocked. There's an ikuv, there's a thin partition that blocks us from experiencing and revealing to ourselves the presence of the infinite. The geder shel shoshanim me'akvo me'lefrotz partzos, and a hedge of roses, a hedge of lilies, blocks it from overriding its limitations. And Rav Kook ends with a beautiful pasuk in Shir Hashirim, which Rav Hillel Zeitlin Hashem Yimkom Domo stresses in his Safran Shel Yechidin. Why does Rav Kook always end his writings with a pasuk? Rav Kook doesn't quote many sources, although in Pinkas Katan, in Metzias Katan, in the new writings, and in Ein Hayah, there's something profound about Rav Kook that you see him really being mafalpel with other sources. In his more mature writings, especially after he came to Eretz Yisrael, and in Reish Millin, even though it was written b'chutz la'aretz, there's no clear source work, and it takes a lot of work to uncover where the sources are. The Eish Shcheira, the black fire that enlivens Rav Kook's white fire. But here Rav Kook is ending with a pasuk that Rav Hillel Zeitlin stresses that the reason Rav Kook ends his teachings with psukim is to show that everything I've just stressed in the poetic, the mystical, the shiri, the song manifestation of my soul is rooted in Torah Shebichsav, is rooted in a pasuk, and he can prove it to you. And Rav Kook ends this piece with the base, with the pasuk from Shir Hashirim, Bitnecha aramaschitim suga b'shoshanim, describing the partition of roses, the limitation of roses, this barrier that is not one, this concealment that is not one, this kli that is both kli and not kli, that is both a light and a vessel in one, which allows us to penetrate and contemplate enough to realize that the duality that we perceive between the aleph and the beis, the achdus and the shnius, is nothing but a difference in manifestation and not, God forbid, a difference in kind. And as we'll see next week, Be'ezras Hashem with the Os Gimel, now we have the Koyach HaGvul of Os Aleph, the first or Ein Sof. And now we have the Chalal, now we have the Tzimtzum, this vessel that the Beis represents. And next week, Be'ezras Hashem with the Gimel, we're going to be getting into actually how we interact with everything afterwards, everything after the Aleph and Beis, after HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the world with Or Ein Sof and decides to limit it. So we'll discuss the Gimel next week, Be'ezras Hashem.